I am pleased to introduce the keynote speaker for this year's Fall 2025 CALA-ACÉL Conference, Dr. Spiros Papageorgiou. Dr. Papageorgiou is a principal measurement scientist in the research division at ETS in Princeton, New Jersey. At ETS, Dr. Papageorgiou conducts research on the assessment of English as a foreign language and is involved in the coordination of the TOEFL internal research program, as well as the external research program supported by the TOEFL Committee of Examiners. Dr. Papageorgiou has published over 50 journal papers, book chapters, and technical reports on topics such as standard setting and score mapping to proficiency levels, score reporting and interpretation, and listening assessment. His recent projects include the mapping of the TOEFL IBT test scores to the China Standards of English Language Ability and TOEFL Steps, a research-based tool that demonstrates the learning path for the TOEFL family of assessments. Dr. Papageorgiou is the co-editor of the edited volume, Global Perspectives on Language Assessment, Research, Theory, and Practice, published in 2019 by Routledge, and the edited volume, Meaningful Language Test Scores, Research to Enhance Score Interpretation, published in 2023 by John Benjamins. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Spiros Papageorgiou for his keynote address, Mapping Test Scores to Language Proficiency Frameworks, Implications for Language Assessment Practice in Canada.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, organizers, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be presenting. This is my first time, so I'm very happy to have that opportunity. We already talked about this topic if you attended the workshop this morning. But let's start first with the conference theme, which I assume you all have read very carefully. Okay, this conference brings together educators, researchers, policymakers, language assessment professionals to explore the dynamic relationship between theoretical frameworks, ethical considerations, practical applications in language testing and assessment. This year's focus is on innovations and challenges in the Canadian context, including the evolving role of artificial intelligence, generative AI, technologies in educational assessment. There's a lot in this conference theme, right? But when it comes to language tests, language assessments, there's one question that we start from. And that's the question that we should always keep in mind, irrespective of what we think about all these important topics that we see in the theme. Why do we use these language tests? Okay? Why? Test use is the starting point for discussions of validity, the foundation for considering issues of theory, ethics, and practicality. So we use test scores because we need to facilitate some kind of decision about language proficiency. And that decision might be in educational context, it might be in workplace context. In Canada, it might be related to immigration decisions, very important topics. So scores from a language proficiency test can be used to infer the language ability of international students after they get admitted into higher education programs, placement in classrooms, and other professional reasons as well. Now, decisions based on language test scores can be extremely consequential. And you might be thinking first thing is there are consequences for the test taker, especially in high stakes contexts, right? But it's not just about the test taker. It's not about a test taker, an international student who might not be admitted because they didn't meet the score requirement, or a professional who might not meet the requirement for immigration to Canada, for example. There are consequences for everybody. There are consequences for the institution. So if you work for a university, the decision might stop you from recruiting a qualified student and might lose talent. And it goes beyond that. It's about our society overall. These are important decisions about people, and everyone will be affected. So what happens in this context then is we need a CAT score, in case you didn't hear me say that this morning at the workshop. Because in the end, what matters is that minimum score requirement. Nothing else matters in these important high-stakes situations. What matters is, if I'm a test taker, if I'm an applicant for immigration to Canada, did I meet the score requirement to be granted my visa, for example? So what happens when institutions and organizations use language test scores, but today we're talking about language scores, it could be information from any other instrument. So in the case of language tests, institutions and organizations don't use just one test, right? There are many tests out there, many language proficiency tests. And what's going to happen is that you could have a test taker, a group of test takers. Test taker takes test A. Let's say for that test, they got a score of 87, and the maximum score they might get on that test is 120. Another test taker got another test. They got a score of 7. The maximum score on that test is 9. And then a third test got a score of 58. The maximum score on that test is 90. Now, if you are familiar with any of the tests that on purpose I'm not naming here, just by telling you the score or the maximum score, you kind of can tell which test it might be, okay? And so that means also that you have a sense of how to interpret the test scores. Here's the issue that institutions need to deal with. It's an issue of fairness when it comes to score requirements. If institutions accept different language tests, they need to be fair to all students by ensuring that these score requirements are comparable. So what do we mean by comparable here? If the score requirements for another test, so for one test is a given score requirement, the other test has another score requirement, but it's not really comparable, but it's too low, then the students that got accepted with the scores of another test whose requirements were lower, these students might not be prepared to deal with the language demands of academic study if we're talking about admission of international students. If the score requirement is not comparable for another test and those scores are higher, then what's going to happen is students who took that test might be left out, might not be included in the admission process. And there are consequences in any case. Students who are qualified are left out. Students who are not prepared are not given the language support that they should be given. But we also need to keep in mind that comparability isn't just about scores, it's about how we interpret scores, what the scores mean, what they measure. So it's not just about comparing the scores, it's about the information that we get from these different tests. So these are the important questions we need to ask. First, we need to ask, do the scores, do we accept these different tests, we use these different tests, are the scores indicative of comparable level of language ability? But the other more complicated question is, do the test scores offer comparable information about language ability? So in language assessment for the last 30 years, we thought answers to these questions we can help get answers to these questions by using language proficiency frameworks. That's a slide that I presented earlier. So there's been a very large body of literature now on the Common European Framework of Reference, the original volume that was introduced in 2001, plus the companion volume in 2021, which did not introduce different proficiency levels, just added more performance descriptors to provide even more explanation of these levels. And as you probably know, even though in Canada there's a different framework that can be used, the CFR is actually widely used outside Europe. If you look in Asia or Latin America, you'll see ministries of education, for example, setting the score requirements in terms of the Common European Framework levels. In Canada, we have a lot of literature and a lot of research on the Canadian language benchmarks, probably the most well-known regional language proficiency framework since 2012. And there's been quite a bit of research on the China Standards of English, another regional framework in a different part of the world. So I briefly mentioned today that what we try to do is try to attach meaning to our test scores by kind of associating the test scores to these proficiency levels and the proficiency descriptors that these levels contain. So if you were at the workshop this morning, you saw this slide. In the literature, you can see different ways of talking about this process of, I've used the word mapping, you can use the word linking, but basically, how do we connect test scores to those language proficiency levels? And one way we can think about this process is in terms of three interrelated components. They're not independent. So the first one has to do about the construct and the content of the test. So we're asking questions like, does the test measure the language skills in a manner consistent with how the framework describes the language proficiency? What levels and descriptors are the most relevant? Those frameworks tend to be very broad. Not everything will be relevant to a test. Then the process of standard setting, which we kind of practiced this morning. This is where we bring the panel of experts to help us answer the important question, which is, what score do I need to be in? What score do I need to be classified at the level that is required? And for that process, we also need to provide evidence that the procedures were implemented properly, that the panelists were consistent in how they made judgments about the cut score, the minimum score requirements. And then we need to provide more evidence to validate those score requirements. And some ways to do that is, for example, with external measures, you could use teacher judgments of the students and then have the students take the test. Compare how scores on the same test map to different proficiency frameworks. So in the context of the Canadian language benchmarks, we have research that shows how the Canadian language benchmarks relate to the CEFR levels. There's published research on that. So if you've done separate mapping studies on your test between the CFR and the CLB, you should get very close to what that other research shows about how the two frameworks relate. And then we can look at different tests that have been mapped to the same proficiency levels. And then if we have other sources like score concordance tables that we'll talk a little bit more about later, that information should also converge. But the bottom line is this. When you go and talk to other decision makers and they ask you, tell me how this test relates to the CLBs because we need to put them on a table on our website and we need to have all the tests together, the first thing we need to ask is, how do we know that these tests have actually done this mapping? That's the first question. Because there's a lot going on to properly conduct score mapping. It's very resource intensive and it takes time. So my talk today will talk basically about this process, and I'm going to be basing it on two different studies. One that I mentioned this morning during the workshop, which was a study to map TOEFL Essentials test scores to the Canadian language benchmarks. But I will also talk today a little bit about another approach to attach meaning or interpret test scores, and that's score concordance. And from that, I will draw on a study that I was involved in to run a concordance study between TOEFL IBT and IELTS academic. So this is the first study. This is the screenshot from the research report. If you go onto that QR code, you can actually download the report. It's available for free. And so you don't need to worry about taking notes. You can read all the details in this report. But before I start, I want to say a little bit more about and try to situate this research into this context and to the point that I was talking about consequences earlier. So recently, this test was added to the list of tests that are accepted in Canada for economic migration. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that now, it happened like a couple of months ago, I think, and that happened right before I got the invitation to come to the conference. And I was like, great, now I can really make the point that test scores have consequences. Imagine taking this test and not meeting the score requirement by 1 point and not being allowed to get your whatever visa you're applying to take. So this was the point I want to make. It's related to this context, but it also to the overall point that there are consequences. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the test design without going into the details. We talked a lot about the speaking test this morning. There's a listening, reading, and writing section as well. There are 4 listening tasks, 3 reading tasks, and 4 writing tasks. The idea here is that with this test, we try to follow what we call a hybrid approach to measuring language. So we try to combine tasks that measure more like foundational skills, and very quickly we can get a lot of information about language proficiency, and then combine them with more communicative tasks and to get more like relevant evidence of language ability. So if you remember from this morning, there's a combination of constrained tasks which teachers, for example, don't always love, but psychometricians love because they can get a lot of information and get the reliability of that section very high. We also found that it helps us put the students quickly into levels and then get more reliable scores, but we combine that with a more communicative task like the virtual interview. So that's the test. And that's the overview of that particular project, right? Again, going back to the earlier slide, we specifically though about this project, so the questions we asked under construct congruence is, does the test measure language skills in a manner that is consistent with how the CLBs describe proficiency? And what are the levels on the CLB that are, and the descriptors that are most relevant to the test? With standard setting, we follow the process that we talked about. We recruited educators in higher education across Canada. I think we represented all provinces in the panel, I think. Or no, 6, I can't remember. But we tried to get people from as many provinces and territories as possible. We went through familiarization activities, homework, make sure that everybody knew enough about the CLB, training them with the standard setting method, going through multiple rounds of judgment, and then provide validation evidence in terms of the procedures, internal consistency, and other external measure. Today, in this talk, I'm talking about these two. I want to talk a little bit about construct congruence. Because what we did in the morning was we talked about standard setting. So now I want to talk a little bit more about construct congruence and validation. So let's start with the first one. So I'm sure most of everybody in this audience today is very familiar with the CLB, but the CLB contains a lot of information about language proficiency. There's a lot in that source. So what we tried to do in preparation for this study was we thought that to evaluate the alignment of test content and CLB, we should look at the profiles of ability and include that into our analysis. They describe abilities, what the learners can do, the context, when communication takes place, performance in terms of strengths and weaknesses. Then we looked at features of communication because they describe expected context in terms of language, texts, situations a learner shouldn't be able to navigate. And we thought that the first two, the profiles of ability and the features of communication, were particularly relevant to the communicative tasks of the test. And then we consider the knowledge and strategies that an individual will need to learn. These are presented progressively in groups of 4 CLBs, so you go 1 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 12. These seem to be a little bit more relevant to those tasks that target more foundational abilities. So after we spent a lot of time deciding what to put together and present it as a package to the team that will look into the construct congruence and then subsequently actually the standard setting panel, the question we started asking ourselves was, all right, there's a lot of information there. How are we going to present that? How are we going to present evidence that the test content and the descriptions of language proficiency in the CLB converge in terms of construct? So, are we going to use a number? How are we going to do that? So what we decided to do is present the results in terms of degree of coverage, because we didn't feel that there was like a number we can use, like what, 100%, 90%? So the way we did it, and I apologize if you cannot see the letters here, but the point I want to say is that those categories are represented like that. And so profiles of ability, features of communication, knowledge and strategies, but we basically used 4 labels. we use extensive, substantial, partial, and negligible coverage. So extensive here would mean the test content covered most or all of the description. Substantial was used when a majority, but not all of the description was covered. Partial meant minority of the, not the minority of the description, and then negligible was used when there was little to no coverage. And then we asked a language researcher and a language test developer to individually tag the content of the test tasks based on these categories, and then look at each other's decisions and then reach agreement, reach consensus, so that we can present the results like this. Now, in terms of constant congruence, I would like to present 4 observations that I think can be relevant to similar studies. So what we found was that for speaking, which was the skill that we focused on this morning, more evidence of content alignment came from virtual interview, which could suggest that the more constrained speech is, the more difficult it is to identify constant congruence between the framework and the test. And that was a question you asked me earlier today. You asked me if the virtual interview, someone said this morning, the virtual interview seems to be easier to work with, and that's what we found as well. Because of the way the performance descriptors are written in these frameworks. Now, with higher proficiency levels, we found that it was always a little bit of a challenge to talk about constant congruence, because when you're at a higher proficiency level, that means that you can operate as a language learner in a wider variety of texts, genres, contexts, and so on. And you might notice, I mentioned this earlier this morning, I said, and that's always a challenge for a language test. How many topics can we put in a language test? We're limited. You know, on the one hand, we need to keep the test relatively short. We also want to make sure that the topics are comparable. And then we try to talk about higher levels of proficiency. And I think one of you mentioned this morning, it's all about being able to operate in a variety of contexts. So that's always a challenge. And so related to the variety of contexts is that the Canadian language benchmarks, the CFR, all these proficiency frameworks, they're written to cover pretty much any situation that a person might find themselves in, right? They tend to be very broad. They have to be broad. They're not supposed to be used only to relate or link the scores of a test. They're supposed to be guidelines for setting learning objectives in the classroom. They have to be broad. But what happens in this case is that when we use language test scores, we use them for a very specific purpose. So there's a conflict there between a language framework that is broadly written and a test whose scores are supposed to give us information about a specific domain. So that's a challenge as well. And the last point is that when we design language proficiency tests, we try to make sure that we test language proficiency. Now, that's very challenging, especially as you go to test higher proficiency levels, because the context of language use matters. And no matter how much we try, no matter how many IRT diff studies we run, the reality is that we need to focus on the concept of language proficiency, which in real life is not disconnected from other abilities. So, for example, your sociolinguistic ability. Now, sociolinguistic ability is very important for language proficiency, right? But when I have a language test and I'm testing international students coming to study in Canada, how fair it is to expect these students to have a well-developed sociolinguistic level of proficiency when they've never lived in Canada, right? But I do want them to have language proficiency that is sufficient for them to study at university. Now, what happens with the CLBs and the CFR and all these frameworks is that they talk a lot about, especially the higher proficiency levels, about aspects of language proficiency that is not just about language proficiency. So I'm moving now from that study. I talked about constant congruence. I'm going to talk about standard setting. Remember this morning I said you know, we've done standard setting before, face-to-face, which is a lot of fun because you meet people, you spend a week together, and so on. But since the pandemic in 2020, we've started doing these kind of studies online, okay? Now, this is a slide that I showed you this morning, which is your typical standard setting day where you will work on speaking. So we'll welcome everybody, we'll talk about the just qualified definitions for speaking, we will train on the standard setting method like I did with you this morning, and then we'll practice the judgment task, we'll go through multiple rounds, and eventually we will finalize the CAT score for speaking. But this is what we would do in one day on a face-to-face meeting. Here's what we did in this study. That was the first time we did online standard setting, remote online standard setting meeting. So we recruited the panelists and we sent them an email and said, this is our first time doing online standard setting meeting, so you, the panelists, need to help us to understand how to do that. And so what the panelists told us is it was more convenient for them to work one weekend on the productive skills, so one day for speaking, one day for writing, and then 2 weekends later work on the receptive skills, reading and listening. They thought that 4 days in a row, online, in front of the computer, would be like too much. So we said, okay, let's do that. So we did January, it should be Friday the 8th, no, it was preparation. So we did preparation, then we did speaking on Friday, and then following day we did writing. Then a week later we did reading and listening. And so we split them into 2 weekends, and then notice the start and end time. Look how weird it is. Why? Yeah, good. In another context, when I asked that question, it took a while for people to realize. So we had people from here, we had someone from Halifax, based in Halifax, and we had someone based in Vancouver, all right? Too many time zones. So 11 made it okay for someone in Vancouver, early start, and 7, was okay for someone in Halifax to finish, right? So already one issue with how to operationalize an online meeting is not as easy as saying, oh, we're going to get people from everywhere. Well, there's time zones. It's not that easy. But, so what we concluded, and there's a book chapter I put there from the book that we published in 2023. My colleague Jonathan Schmidgal, he did 3 online studies right when the pandemic started. So he was actually, I think, ready to start a standard setting study, face-to-face, right when the pandemic started. And so, because we had a year to prepare for it. And so he had to quickly pivot and change it. And then I said, Jonathan, I think you really need to share your experience because you were the very first person that had to deal with that situation. So in his chapter, he says, look, the benefits are very obvious. You have low cost, right? It costs a lot of money to bring 20 people to one place. Let's not forget that. It's a very big expense. Geographical access. Now, all of a sudden, maybe you can recruit panelists from areas that it would be very difficult to recruit them before. In one of his studies, he actually used multiple panels. He split the group into multiple panels, and they were working separately, and he could still coordinate them because he could connect with them at the same time. One thing I think is very useful with online standard setting, and probably I would say probably the strongest argument in terms of procedures, is that those asynchronous tasks can be done at the panelist's own time. So you're in a standard setting meeting, right? Like we kind of simulated this morning, and you have to have the first round of judgments as an individual task. So what happens for an hour is quiet, right? Which is okay, but there's no need for everybody to be in the same room for a task that is individual. Now, when you're online, what we told our panelists in that study was, you have 2 days to complete your ratings. So choose in the next 2 days what time works best for you. And by the end of day 2, we would receive the ratings electronically. And the other thing is that now we have the technological advantages of breakout rooms, recording of sessions. The recording of the sessions is great. It's not that easy in a big room how you, with these virtual meetings, it's very easy to record the discussion. And actually, you can hear people better in the recording because they're in front of the computer, they have their mic. It's not very easy with a face-to-face meeting, but there are challenges. Time zones, obviously we talked about it. Sharing of test materials. Like some of the meetings we had, it was in other studies, we really had to make sure, we literally had to make sure that no one takes anything out of the room. You can imagine how this is being an issue, right? When you're in a face-to-face meeting, it's very easy for me as a facilitator to make sure that the panelists didn't take any of the materials out of the room, especially if it's a high-stakes test. We literally had to tell people in one of the studies, all the phones go into your bags. If we see a phone on the table, we'll have to take it until the end of the day. So literally for 8 hours, nobody was allowed to, we didn't allow a cell phone in the room. If they wanted to use their cell phone, they had to go out because of, security concerns. And I think, so you don't have much control over that on an online meeting. But I think procedurally again, it's the quality of the interaction among the panelists. So you know that because you're in front of Zoom or Teams all the time. In a standard setting study, what is an important procedural aspect is that the panel discusses the judgments. This is very important because the panel needs to agree. Naturally, when you are in front of Teams or Zoom and you're not the kind of panelist that will contribute a lot, it's very easy to be silent. In a room, as a facilitator, I would make sure that everyone will talk. I will simply tend to say, "What do you think? We haven't heard you, we haven't heard what you think. Tell us a little bit more about what you think about this CAT score. Do you think it's too high? It's too low?" So I think that's the biggest challenge procedurally. So I covered two components of the first study. One was the construct congruence, and the other one was the experience of doing those virtual standard setting meetings. And again, we're doing all this because the idea is that connecting test scores to the levels of those language proficiency frameworks will help us kind of compare the different scores. But actually, that's not as straightforward as we think. So when test providers say, here's my score scale, and here's how the scores relate to the language proficiency levels of CLB, there is no authority out there to certify, yes, that's it. There's no quality control outside the test provider. The test provider can commission a third party to do the study and so on, but there's no government agency that goes say, here's your stamp, you did it right, that's what we certify you. And that's a problem because there's a paper in Language Assessment Quarterly 2018. So in this paper, Tony Green reviewed the score mapping of different tests. I think it was TOEFL, IBT, IELTS, PT, Academic, and I think Cambridge C1. And so what he did was he looked at any score concordance studies and score mapping studies and tried to see if the information will converge. And guess what he found? He found they don't. One test provider's B2, interpretation of B2, when I look at a score concordance study that matches the two score scales, and then I looked at the score mapping, totally different. Yeah, he found one test provider says B2, the equivalent score based on score concordance study is actually A2 or B1. So what that means is that we have a problem that language proficiency frameworks, when you use them as this super scale, right? The super scale that everybody links the scores to, might not give us this direct empirical comparison of test scores. But there is a different way of connecting. So if the goal is to compare the different scores, the scores of different tests, there is a more direct empirical way. And that's the other study I want to talk about. And again, it's published. You can download it from the website. This is the score concordance study that ETS colleagues and I did with some colleagues from the IELTS partners. And basically, that's what a static study does. If you work for a university, I'm sure you've seen score concordance tables by the different providers, and you probably have asked all test providers, why can't you guys sit all together and give me one table so I don't have to go to different websites? That's a different story. We'll talk about it later in the Q&A. So the good news is that in the language assessment field we have a published study now, which has been cited many, many times, that gives us a set of criteria of how to create these score concordance tables and evaluate them. And the criteria, to summarize them, are pretty straightforward. You have two tests. It makes sense for these two tests to measure closely related constructs. Construct congruence, it's the same thing, by the way. You can't have two tests that are substantially different and then go ahead and build a score concordance table. I can do that with any two sets of data. To be meaningful, it has to be tests that are relevant. We need the score correlations to be strong because they give us indication that they do measure similar abilities. We need administration conditions that are similar. We need a study population that mirrors the test-taking population, preferably data from official test score reports, a design that is counterbalanced on, a big issue with these studies is that if I'm a test provider, it's easier for me to take some of my test takers and then send them to take another test. The problem I have there is that there might be a test order effect, and my test takers might be familiar with the test that they took, but not with the other test. And we also want the interval to be very close, because if there's a very large interval, maybe the proficiency has changed, the proficiency level has changed. So in this study, we use data from 969 students, 937 after we cleaned the data, counterbalance design, almost perfect, like 467 took one test, the 470 took the test in the opposite order. We tried to resample in a representative way in terms of proficiency level and first language background. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Test administration, the Noch and Fun guidelines say no more than 3 months. We all know that lots of things can happen in 3 months when you're a language learner. We try to go even lower than that, on average 38.5 days. We use test-centered versions only, so that we don't use more of one condition for one test and more of the other. We decided to commission a third party to analyze the data. So we work with our local partners to collect data, but we send the data to a third party to analyze it. And then we commission a different third party to do the construct comparability study. And you can actually download the report either from the IELTS website or the ETS website. We agreed with IELTS to publish the same content twice, basically, so that people can access it from either website. So in terms of first language, here's the challenge here. I said we had the 937 test takers. You can see at the bottom right. So yes, the rule makes a lot of sense. What you want is the study population to be representative of the test takers. Whose test takers? TOEFL or IELTS? They're not the same. So what happens, for example, with TOEFL, for both tests, for example, speakers of Chinese is a large population. But it's a larger population for TOEFL than it is for IELTS. In the opposite direction, speakers of languages in India are a larger proportion for IELTS than they are for TOEFL. So really, sampling here now starts becoming a little bit more complicated. Whose test-taking population will sample? So what we tried to do was, we tried to at least get groups from the major L1 backgrounds for both tests. And on top of that, we tried to sample languages that were, at that point, major L1 groups for immigration in Australia, because the background to that study, the initial motivation was we wanted to do a study that was needed in Australia. So, and then of course the question is, so are we doing a score concordance study only for that population? No, we can't have multiple score concordance studies. The goal of a score concordance study is to put together the scores of two tests and put them next to each other and try to show score users how they compare. So these were the different things that we had to address in that process. Then the score distribution. So I'm showing this in terms of IELTS scores because IELTS uses a 9 band level score scale with half points, and it's kind of easier to explain this this point here about score distributions. So as you can see, the majority of the test takers were between IELTS 5.5 and 7.5. We had it was very, very challenging to get test takers with scores that are lower than that, okay? And that makes sense. If you really need to take IELTS and your language proficiency is not anywhere near 5, why would you take it? You're not ready. So what's the point of trying to find test takers who get a score of 1 or 2 or 3? Now, you might think this is a problem. I would argue that not really. I think the important thing here is which score points are the most important for decision making. How many decisions are made out there with IELTS scores of less than 4.5? The one we found was a very specific, is it visa category in Australia that I think requires 4.5 or 4. Anything else in the major context where language proficiency scores are used, usually we start from 5 and higher. And usually by 7.5, that's the highest score requirement. So a refinement of the criterion that Noah and Fan presented in their paper is that you might not be able to get scores at the two ends of the scale. You need to, however, enough scores where the important decision points the important decisions are made. In terms of score correlations, you see two sets of correlations. You see an earlier study we did in 2010. That was a study that ETS did on its own years before I joined ETS. And then the one, you can see the years there, right? 2010 to 2025. And you will probably immediately notice the improvement in the score correlations. Now, there are some changes in the content of the test, especially for TOEFL IBT at that point. One of the two tasks had changed for writing. And pre-testing questions, the ones that are not used for scoring, had been removed. But these are noticeable improvements in the correlations, and we think the reason that happened, although we cannot know for sure, is because of the methodology. We spent more time collecting data. We had all the scores, not just official score reports, but we went for each individual test taker. We logged in on either the TOEFL score verification website or the IELTS score verification site, and we verified the official score reports just to make sure that we got the correct numbers. So in this case, we had an improvement in the correlations. And this is the score concordance results. You can find them in the report, but what I've done in this table is that I'm presenting two numbers for each score. So you see the IELTS band, because it's easier to group them by IELTS band. And then you see the 4 section scores and the total score. Now, the section scores go from 0 to 30, and the total on TOEFL is the sum of the 4 section scores, right? So let's look at the last column, the total score. And I'm going to start with the top, right? An IELTS band total score 9 would be the highest score on TOEFL, 120. And in the previous study, it was 118. For 8.5, 0 change, it's still 115. For 8, it's 108 minus 2. So as you look at these numbers, what you're seeing is that there is a little bit of a difference, right? But think about it, it's 120 score points, and the scores change 0, 1, 2, we have a 7 down to 6. Now, to give you a sense of how much the scores did not change, the standard error of measurement for the 120 point score scale is 4. So for many of these scores, we have less than 1 standard error of measurement change. Pretty good. Different studies, 15 years apart. TOEFL changed part of the writing section. IELTS had changed some of the writing scoring rubric. Different population, different methodologies. And we spent all this time working the study to change the cut scores by 2 points with a 4-point SEM. But if you're a test taker, that's important. If you're a test taker and the score requirement of your university is 6, right? Now you have to get a score of 67 on TOEFL. Before that it was 60. Would you rather have been asked to submit 67 or 60? Okay? So yes, for us that look at it with our researcher hat, great study, shows that both studies, were designed well, they converge, but in the real world there are consequences. And there are consequences when we look at converging to the extent to which information from score mapping and score concordance converges, okay? So this is the table again that looks at the total score, right? And this is the separate information that IELTS and TOEFL provide about score mapping. So, 7. Let's take IELTS band 7. The score concordance study found that it was minimum of 91, between 91 and 99, right? Because 7.5 starts at 100. You would expect these to be same CFR level. So look at the sides now. They're not. So now what we're seeing is, in the middle, 7 and 91, it's B2 for TOEFL, but C1 for IELTS. Now, that 91 is not, it makes sense actually, because C1 starts at 95. We can't get exact convergence, but it's pretty close. That makes sense, right? But look at, as we're going lower at the scale. Now, we're starting seeing a very noticeable discrepancy. 6, according to IELTS, is B2. 67, according to TOEFL, would be B1. Again, not that far from B2 because it's 72 to be at B2. But here's at 5.5, right? 5.5, according to IELTS, is still B2. The score concordance study found 51 to be the minimum score. 51 goes really much lower, goes to B1. 42 is the starting point for B1. What also that means is that if a university has a requirement of 5.5 and says, that's B2, so I want the equivalent B2 for TOEFL, a TOEFL test taker will need to submit a score of 72, right? But the empirical concordance study shows that the equivalent score based on score concordance is 51. So now the test taker is asked to submit a score, to give a score that is 22 points higher, 21 points higher than what would actually be the equivalent of 5.5. So in this example, if the institution has set score requirements not based on score concordance evidence, so not based on the table in the middle, but based on what the two test providers claim in terms of score mapping, the requirements are very different. If I'm a test taker, I'd rather you use the score concordance table, because if you use the score mapping, the separate score mapping studies, and I took TOEFL, I need to give you a higher score than what the score concordance study says. And by the way, I'm not saying that either TOEFL's interpretation of the CFR levels is the correct one or IELTS. The point I'm making here is that two different methods that are used for the same purpose to compare scores can give us very different results. And when we make important decisions like admission or immigration, we have to be very careful about that. Thank you. And I will conclude with one slide to make it a very Canadian presentation. Who remembers SDS? All of you. SDS was the Student Direct Stream Visa program that was discontinued in November. For that program, the requirement was a score of 6 on IELTS. Okay? 6 on TOEFL would be 67. All right, so you would assume that for SDS, the requirement would be, if not 67, maybe 70. Let's make it a round number, right? Let's say 70. You know what the requirement for TOEFL was for SDS? It was 83. Now 83 is 6.5. So what was happening there is, if you were an applicant for the SDS program in Canada and you took TOEFL, you were required to submit a score that was half band higher than the person who took IELTS. Again, I'm not saying that the score requirement should be 6 or 6.5 or 67 or 81. That's not for me to decide. What I'm saying is different methods used for the same purpose take us to very different decisions. And that's a very high stakes context of language test scores. It matters, right? So the conclusion here is, these are two methodologies to help us set useful and fair score requirements. The challenge we have is that these different methodologies can help us with score comparisons, but they should not be the only source that we use. Additional sources should be considered when we're deciding on score requirements. And the challenge is that language proficiency is a necessary condition for success, whether it's success at university, success in the workplace, but it's not sufficient. If language proficiency was the most important factor for academic success, your international students would always be performing worse than your L1 English students, and we all know that's not the case. So other factors will affect academic success, and they can be personal factors, they can be social factors. And for us that work in test development and validation, the challenge is always that we're trying to develop a test that is about language proficiency, but many times we're asked to talk about performance in areas that are not about language proficiency only. Because language proficiency is just one piece of the puzzle. Students can perform very well on a language test and fail academically. Students with lower scores might perform very well academically, especially if your school, your institution, gives them the language support through an English language center, for example. So the bottom line is, and that comes from someone who works for a test provider, don't just look at language test scores. Just treat the language test scores as the piece of the puzzle to make the decisions, whether it's for workplace, immigration, whether it's for academic study, and so on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And very exciting to see the new concordance study. I heard that TOEFL is introducing a new scale, new score scale. So I was just curious how what your plans are in terms of the concordance and mapping to frameworks.
So the good thing is that for the new score scale that will be introduced in January, we already had data from a vertical linking study that we did. When did we do that? 3 or 4 years ago. So it's not just the scale that is changing, the tasks are changing too. So we had a population that took the tasks that will appear in the new test and take the existing test. So we have internally a data set that of a common population that took the tasks of both tests. So we did vertical linking, and that's what we will be able to do at launch. In an ideal world, as you've done also in your context, we will constantly updating the score concordance studies because now we have different test content. So in an ideal world, we will do more studies because now we have like the new test, like the current test and the updated test. I would like us to do a study eventually that, we do again the IELTS study, like Duolingo has done, like you've done the TOEFL and IELTS concordance a few times now, every time the test changes, and that's a good practice, right? So we have the data for the launch, but I would like us to be able to do more as the test goes operational. And I know it's very inconvenient for institutions to constantly revise your score concordance table, but I think it's our responsibility as test providers to do it, especially when the test content changes. So first of all, let me clarify. I still think that having the language test scores is an important piece of the puzzle, right? So you said some students haven't taken the score. I'm not saying that, obviously, and I'm not saying this because I work for a test provider. I think language proficiency test scores tell us something. It's an important part of, you really need to have the language, you need to be above a threshold to be able to perform. Yeah. The reason I'm mentioning this is because many times when we talk to admissions officers, we hear a lot about, the students got the test and they didn't do very well. And then you start asking questions. And usually the first question is, what are your sub-score requirements? We don't have any. Okay, so students can get the total score in many different ways. So in your case, maybe they had a very low speaking score, but they were able to compensate because you don't have section scores. I think what you're saying is basically we get all this information, but in the end, we need some guidance. And unfortunately, and I know I drive my ETS, my TOEFL colleagues crazy when I say this thing, unfortunately, test providers should not tell score users what score to accept. I know it sounds very idealistic, but the reality is you are the score user. So a score of 80 on TOEFL, or 6 on IELTS, or whatever on any other test, might work well for University A, but not so well for University B. Perhaps because University A doesn't have the resources for a language center. But if University B has an extensive English language program, maybe students that haven't met the score requirement by a little bit, maybe we can still accept them. And in the UK, they call them pre-sessional programs. They give people conditional admission. They have to go through 8 weeks of classes. So I think the challenge that you are talking about is that not a single score requirement will work for every institution. There's no shortcuts on that. So we can tell you what CLB7, for example, is on our test, right? What happens to a student that missed the CLB7 score by 1 point? Will you tell that student we're not going to get admitted? Or you tell that student, here's your conditional offer, you need to come 2 months earlier and take classes. I would advocate for the second approach. So I see the role of the test providers as consulting the score users, but not making the decisions for the score user. And one more thing, CAT scores should not be set once and be done. They should constantly be reviewed. Every year, ideally. Look at the cohort of students. Did they perform well? Was it because you don't have any language support anymore? Raise your score requirement. Do you get some funding to do more language classes? Maybe you can lower the score requirement to increase the pool of applicants that can apply. I think that's really the challenge. We should not, as test providers, tell institutions what score to accept. We can consult them, we can help them, but the decision should be by the score user. Thank you.